Today, I want to focus a little more on the semi-continuous readings. So since the Sunday after Holy Trinity, we've shifted to a different set of readings for the Psalm and the first reading, the so-called semi-continuous readings. They are not part of the regular lectionary, but they are an option to include texts that are otherwise unnoticed. They wouldn't be read during worship, and that would honestly be a missed opportunity. Over the last 4 weeks, we've heard texts from the story of Abraham in the first reading. It started out with how Abraham was sent out by God to go from your country to the land that I will show you, promising that his descendants will be a great nation and that in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed. And Abraham trusts in God and sets out with his family and finds a new area to live with Sarah and all their people. But Abraham and Sarah are not able to have children. And after years and decades, God's promise of children, of descendants, seems to have been false or misunderstood, maybe. So Abraham and Sarah decide to take matters in their own hands and plan to use Hagar, Sarah's Egyptian slave, as a surrogate. And Hagar bears a son, Ishmael. Is that the way that God had foreseen that Abraham would become a great nation? Unexpectedly, miraculously, Sarah becomes pregnant at her old age and bears Isaac. And seeing God's promise fulfilled only in Isaac, Sarah convinces Abraham to send Hagar and Ishmael into the wilderness, the hot, dry desert, a death sentence. Sarah wants Isaac alone, her son, to inherit God's blessing. Distressed, Abraham agrees with Sarah's plan. They both seem to be driven by a mindset of scarcity, jealousy, and greed. And today, we end the cycle of stories about Abraham with the gruesome story of Isaac's almost sacrifice to God. God, who had promised Abraham that he would have offspring that make a great nation, and him, Abraham, a blessing. Again, a false promise? And is this our God, the God of creation, the God of faithfulness, who orders a father to sacrifice his own child? This story is hard to digest. It says a lot about our history and culture that the Abraham-Isaac story is more often mentioned and found to be much more cruel than the Hagar-Ishmael story. We seem to have more compassion for the already privileged born son of the people in power, Abraham, and through him his wife Sarah, than with the enslaved and from Egypt deported Hagar, who has no say in becoming a surrogate for her enslavers. It was a common practice, after all, as other biblical texts show. Isaac himself has sons with 4 women, his 2 wives and his 2 slaves. But how often do we stop and say, it might have been common practice, but that doesn't make it right? How often do we stop in our daily routines and question our attitudes or thoughts that creep up when we see people without home or shelter, without medical support they need? They must have done something to deserve this, right? They must have somehow chosen this path. There's help for this sort of people. Why don't they make use of it? But we also know that living in a society, and especially living in a capitalist and patriarchal society, is more complex than that. Hagar, the female defenseless slave, and her son, a helpless child, both fall under what Jesus describes as these little ones in today's gospel reading. Whoever welcomes you welcomes me, and whoever welcomes me welcomes the one who sent me. And whoever gives even a cup of cold water to one of these little ones in the name of a disciple, truly I tell you, none of these will lose their reward. Granted, that Abraham-Isaac story leads us to ask, how can God order a child sacrifice? What kind of God is this? That's a legit question. But it also shows something else. We are so primed to identify with people like Abraham, with those in charge and those in power. Again, we don't really hesitate and wonder about the cruelty and the inevitable death that Hagar and Ishmael have been sentenced to by their fellow humans and people in power. We just think that's how it was at that time, and we leave it at that. But I think it's a dangerous thought, because it leads us to say the same today. That's just how it is. Sorry. There will usually be straight white men in charge. That's the hierarchy of power. That's just how it is. And their word usually has more weight above and beyond everything else. It stands above a woman's report of being raped, above the right to live out your gender identity and sexuality, above the right to make decisions about your own body, above people of color and their experience of racism in this country. Racism? What racism? The Genesis story of Abraham, Sarah, Hagar, Ishmael, and Isaac is about 2,500 years old, but feels chillingly current. In my preparation for this sermon, I read a text that argues that both stories, the Hagar-Ishmael story and the Abraham-Isaac story, have so many similarities that they need to be read together in order to understand the whole. Both stories center around an apparent death march for one of Abraham's children. In both stories, God saves the child at the last moment. Both include the themes of descendants and blessing and trust, and in the end, God's promise comes true for both of them. God makes a great nation from Ishmael and from Isaac. Therefore, I think the God that saves Ishmael doesn't want Isaac to die either. Instead, I think the second story is a consequence of the first, a learning opportunity for Abraham to be humbled and to understand his responsibility. Something like this. All right, Abraham, if you're willing to turn your back on your own kin, to send your own child to his death for your own selfish gain, let's see how that works out for you. Just as you sent out Hagar into the wilderness on a death march with her only child, now you will taste your own medicine. Now you will be sent out on a death march with your only child. Just as you attempted to cut off Hagar and Ishmael from inheriting the blessing of the covenant, now you will contemplate being cut off from the covenantal blessing by your own hand. You attempted to exclude, now you feel what it's like to be excluded by your own hand. You maneuvered for gain to make Isaac the only heir. Now you will face losing everything by your own hand. Now you must renounce and relinquish. Now you must be humbled. Now you must choose between arrogant faith and entitlement and genuine faith and trust. Between faith for the sake of gain and faith for the sake of love. For love seeks to serve and to share, not to demand blessings to itself. God is testing Abraham with the goal to restore and strengthen the trusting relationship between God and Abraham. And instead of blaming God to be cruel by asking Abraham to kill his son, which, yes, from Abraham's perspective is a legitimate point, we should reconsider. Is it really God who is evil here or cruel? Or is it just easier for us to put the blame on God? Because isn't God the God of creation, of self-sacrifice, compassion, and love? And that brings me back to today's gospel. Whoever welcomes me welcomes you. And whoever welcomes me welcomes the one who sent me. And whoever gives even a cup of cold water to one of these little ones in the name of a disciple, truly I tell you, none of these will lose their reward. Who are these little ones? Everyone who is in a position of need, of less power, wealth, and perceived societal value than yourself. And to clarify, our starting points here in the congregation are not necessarily the same, even if we are all part of this congregation. But we, you and me, as individuals and as a society, are responsible for these little ones. To see the needs of these little ones and welcome everyone, I guess we have some work to do, again, as individuals and as a society, to widen our gaze beyond what we are primed to see and whom to be compassionate with, and beyond the things that keep us too busy to initiate change, to humble ourselves and reaching out to our siblings not from a position of power, but as broken and suffering equals who admit that the little ones have a legitimate perspective that makes us uncomfortable for a reason. To expose ourselves to our guilt in this unjust system and work through it. And all that with the goal to share the love of God and not limit it. It's not a scarce resource, like Abraham and Sarah felt. It will spread and expand the more we share and give. Let love be our guide. When we don't feel love or compassion for someone, let us ask why. When we don't want to welcome someone into our lives, our congregation, let us ask why. And why again. Let's dig deep. And maybe the answer is surprisingly personal. Amen.